Welcome everyone on behalf of Center for India West Asia Dialogue. And today we are very, very privileged to have the book discussion on reorienting the Middle East. And but it is very, very rare to have academics of such valor and dexterity with so much of work, academic work, which has been done in uh, uh, paradigms that are often neglected at a wider scale. And that is why I'm very, very thankful to all of you for being present today. And with this, I'll start with the introduction of all our panelists. My name is Dr. Shubhda Chaudhary, and I'm the editor for Center for India West Asia Dialogue, which is a think tank based out of New Delhi. We specialize on basically foreign policy, economics, political, cultural, sociological, all the discourses which bind India with West Asia. And that is one of the very interesting ambits of the book, too. Specifically, South Asia, Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia, also the interconnection of the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, and how the fluidity of films, the fluidity of films are something which are still so unexplored in terms of categorizing with the historical and sociological relationships between these littoral spaces. So I'm very, very thankful to all of you. Let us start with the introduction of our first speaker, Professor Dale Hudson. He's an associate professor of film and new media studies at New York University at Abu Dhabi. His research on film and media relates to South Asia and Southwest Asia, which has appeared in journals including Arabian Humanities Cinema Journal, Studies in South Asian Film and Media in Jadalia, the Journal of Palestine Studies, Social Research, and various anthologies. With Alia Yunis, he has co-edited a special double issue of Middle East Journal of Culture and Communication titled as Film and Visual Media in the Gulf, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives, along with Reorienting the Middle East, Film and Digital Media where the Persian Gulf, Arabian Sea, and the Indian Ocean meet. He is also co-curating relational elements as part of the Personal Structures 2024 exhibition at the European Cultural Center, Italy. And I'm very thankful that you were so engrossed and inundated with so much of work and you found time, for us. He is right now in the middle of the organizing the exhibition. He has been a member of the board of directors for the Association of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies since 2017 and coordinated film from the Gulf at the Middle East Studies Association Film Festival since 2016. So I'm very thankful to you, sir, for being present. Then we have Professor Alia Yunis, and I'm going to read. I don't think so that I can do complete justice with whatever time I have in explaining your pedigree, but I'll speak from your website. Alia Yunus has worked as a journalist, author, filmmaker on 6 continents, focusing on memory and heritage, and some science fiction, particularly in Muslim and Arab worlds and the diaspora. Her fiction and non-fiction writings and film works have been translated into 10 languages. She is also a professor of film and heritage studies, most recently at New York University, Abu Dhabi. Her feature documentary, The Golden Harvest, made its debut at, let me know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Thessaloniki. Um,
Yeah.
okay, Thessaloniki International Film Festival, and it won the Best of the Fest at its US debut at Minneapolis St. Paul International Film Festival, and continues to play in festivals and events around the world. Alia thinks about trees a lot and is currently producing an interactive documentary, Tree Rooted, connecting people's personal stories around their trees to a shared heritage across the oceans. She is also developing a documentary on the unexpected connections between date palm, very interesting, the US and the Gulf. She recently wrote for her favorite magazine on mango madness. In terms of her scholarly work, she most recently co-edited Reorienting the Middle East, Film and Digital Media where the Persian Gulf, Arabian Sea, and Indian Ocean meet, the book which we are going to discuss today. She also co-edited a special double issue on film and visual media in the Gulf for the Middle East Journal of Culture and Communication, and is one of the contributing writers on the Historical Dictionary of Middle Eastern Cinema and Oxford bibliographies, and has contributed a chapter on UAE documentaries for documentary filmmaking in the Middle East and North Africa. Um, After that, I'm very privileged to also have with us Professor Bindu Menon, who is also a JNUite and one of my seniors. So right now she is the associate professor in the School of Arts and Sciences at Azim Premji University in Bangalore. And prior to joining that, she was the assistant professor at LSR, University of Delhi from 2005 to 2020. She received a PhD in Cinema and Cultural Studies from School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU. Her doctoral research was supported by Fulbright Junior Research Fellowship, UGC Junior Research Fellowship, Sarai CSGS Urban Research Fellowship, Charles Wallace Archival Research Grant, and Spear Grant for Archival Research. She has held 3 postdoctoral fellowships at the Center for Studies in Religion and Society at University of Victoria in Canada, Indian Institute of Advanced Studies in Shimla, and International Institute of Asian Studies at Leiden in Netherlands. So thank you to all of you for being present. And I would also...
are. We're really grateful and honored that you were interested in hearing about this book. This book is a long labor of love from all 3 people you see here today. And it comes from, well, for my work has been engaged with the Gulf for a really long time. It was where I had my first job after university, working at what's now Al Jazeera, and my parents actually met in Kuwait. So I've always been intertwined with the Gulf, and it's been my focus of academic study. And I know that's very true of Dale as well. And this book started with a conference in 2018 where we thought, let's bring together all these people that are working on the Gulf in different ways, but looking at it through media, specifically film, but also digital media, because this is a very, very young part of the world. The majority of people in the Gulf are under the age of 35, and even they're under the age of 25. So it's also very important to engage with how they are engaging with media, which is not the tradition, which is not only in theaters and with the exception of recently Saudi Arabia because of the opening of theaters. So that's sort of how the book, and it's also because if you live in the Gulf, you cannot, it's a minority population of citizens, and the majority of the population is coming from South Asia or from the rest of the Arab world, the Levant specifically, and Egypt, and Morocco. And so we wanted to really address how this history is not new. This history goes way back before the discovery of oil, and it's it's about the trade routes that would go through, and the religious trade routes, because there's the migration to Mecca, but also there's the trade routes between India or South Asia, I should say, and the Gulf that, of course, was very vital during the pearl industry, but also was related by, for example, through dates. Also, that was a huge commodity that was going between those two regions. So we tried to show the connectivity of it all. And there's many chapters in the book that we may touch upon a bit on this topic, but just to mention that there was the conference, and from the conference there was also a double issue on film and visual media in the Gulf for Middle East Journal of Culture and Communication. And in that chapter, I think you'll find some also interesting chapters about the connection to the Gulf and South Asia. There's an article, a very interesting article in there about Oman and how Oman was the conduit for Bollywood films going between India and Pakistan. when that was a particularly challenging time for that to happen. And there's another chapter in there that deals with the recently closed Bollywood recreational theme park that was in Dubai, that also engaged, of course, in the huge influence of Bollywood in the Gulf. Dale is going to carry on with more specifics and look at it in terms of area studies, but I'll just give you a bit of a historical background. So what we consider in the Gulf now to have been the first feature films made, we have to look at three different things. One would be the Aramco and all the oil companies that were producing films in the Gulf, mostly European and American, and they were the ones who created this framework of the Bedouin rising out of the desert, as if the area didn't have many connections to the rest of the world for a long time before that. Then Disney stepped in 1971 and made, in partnership with the Bahraini government, or the ruler of Bahrain, they made the Hamid and the Pirates, which dealt with the pearl trade, of course, and was again framing Bahrain in that narrative. And it's a little scene film, but it exists in its full entity on YouTube if you're interested. And it's very much, I don't want to use the word propaganda, but it's not so much about the story as it is about framing Bahrain. And then in this book, if you're interested in the history of these oil company films, I would recommend Firat Orak's chapter. You're going to hear from Bindu soon, but a lot of the digital media also deals with issue of race, and in fact, I'm going to go ahead to the next slide, I think. Dale, is that you with the slides? I'm lost. Wait, hang on.
It's
Okay.
with me.
Okay, if we look at the one, yeah, these are some of the chapters. If we pause here, I'm going to pause here because the person on this stage is Khalid Al-Sadiq, and he is considered to have been the first Gulf filmmaker to produce a feature film. And the film is called Basya Bahar, or The Cruel Sea in English, and it's considered by many, including myself, to be the best feature film to have come out of the Gulf, even though it was made in 1971. And it was made in 1971, and then there was this huge gap aside from sporadic filmmaking until 2008, when the UAE and Qatar both started to invest heavily in the idea of making film. But they followed a bit of the official narrative of the Gulf, in this idea of being, something that came about when petrol came about, and that other than that, it was an isolated area, and his film does engage. It's about the pearl trade, and it does engage with obviously the pearl trade was with India, and it's there are things there that we discuss in the book that are absent in the film, like the fact that the majority of the people on the ships were also from Africa. So there is this whole also connection to Africa, and I don't want to use the word slave because it's not quite the same system there, but it's in that vein. And so you have, let's say, indentured servants. I think if you go to the next slide, so here you can see some of the films that have come out that follow this narrative, that are feature films. Black Gold was this huge extravaganza that Qatar did that was a complete bomb. It was about the oil industry, and a lot of these films are produced by Europeans. So even though they're funded by the Gulf and they're about the Gulf, they're losing some of their voice because the producers behind it are thinking about a European market because they are European. And in many cases, they are actually the directors also. I think that probably, and you see in around 2011, in the corner, you see a film called Sea Shadow, and that's the beginning of the UAE film industry, which now is a little bit more dormant than the Saudi one. And the Saudi one, which is not addressed as much in our book because it's so recent, is really pushing the envelope more than the Gulf. They are, sorry, than the UAE or Qatar. But Qatar is still the one funding Pan-Arab and South Asian film more, especially young filmmakers. So I don't want to talk too much for the sake of having time for Q&A and other things. So I talked about this. Here's this shot from Bestia, not Bestia Bahar. On the left, you can see Hamid and the Pirates. Here on the right, upper right corner, you see some of the films made by the first filmmakers. The other group of people we should recognize are the wives of the British that were in the Gulf at the time. And of course, they were in India at the time also. And they were filming these images that they would see outside their windows or at festivals, and they actually captured daily life in a way that is actually very valuable to us to look at, but they also frame it as the outsider looking in. And of course they exoticize it because it would have been exotic for them to see this in their within the colonial narrative that was across the region at that time, not just in the Gulf, but across the Arab world. And then did we go? Okay. So I think then it's really important now just to look briefly at if you really want to get to know this interconnection and this dialogue, I think some of the best places are the digital media. On the left, you see a group coming out of Saudi Arabia. They are now making feature films with government support, but 10 years ago, they were making things on their own and producing them on their own. And they were very satirical. All of these young filmmakers working in the digital, working on YouTube, were sarcastic and taking digs at the society. And a lot of it is about the interconnections between the different levels of society, the different nationalities and how they engage. And so they're certainly well worth looking for. The one on the right actually is particularly maybe amusing for you. This is a Jordanian and an Indian a duo that live in Dubai, and they produce all these satirical videos that make fun of the daily culture in the Gulf. But also they go to Jordan and they go to India. I believe the one who's Jordanian is also half Indian. So their name is Jord Indian instead of Jordanian, Jordanian. See, clever. And they are, but they had a huge following. Maybe they're less popular in the last couple of years because they've been relatively quiet in the last couple of years. I think I just looked, and their last one was made at the Apple Store in India. I'm not sure which city. And one of them is stuck in traffic in Dubai, and the other one made it to India already. And they're the next slide then. I think here I'm going to turn it over to Dale. I know I went through a lot kind of quickly, but we're happy to answer any questions later. Thank you, Dale.
Thank you. Thank you, Alia. Thank you, everybody, for inviting us. So one of the things that emerged when we did this conference in 2018, and there's also a course that we've been teaching here since 2014, looking at these connections, is that the way that film studies has been set up kind of typically follows area studies models. And that completely makes sense to us. And we appreciate that because people from area studies brought that kind of really deep knowledge that film studies did not have, because film studies was mostly focused on Western media. At the same time, we wanted to look at the spaces in between, and we didn't want to have culture being defined by foreigners in terms of these regions. So we looked at the way that, if you look on the top, it's an image of what sometimes is defined as the Middle East from the United States perspective. And the United States was the dominant power, after the Cold War. And this includes all of North Africa, all of Southwest Asia. And it also extends into parts of South Asia with Afghanistan and sometimes Pakistan. And this is after 9/11. Makes completely no sense because Morocco and Pakistan are very, very different cultures and don't have that much connection between them. whereas there's other places that do have more connections between them. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to try to think about the connections between these and to tap back into that really old history. Okay, so it says, Ali had discussed before, the Nabatean Arabic traders have been trading since the 2nd century CE. So this is happening a long time, and then it was interrupted by the Portuguese and by the British in particular. And we wanted to flip it around. So on the lower image is one of the posters of CAMP, which is a Bandra-based art collective. And it was a film they did, which in English is called From Gulf to Gulf to Gulf. And if you look at that, what they've done is they've reversed the typical positive and negative that we're used to on maps. So the blue on the top one shows the land that we're supposed to focus on. The bottom one shows the blue land, but it's actually the white area, which is the Gulf, which is the area that sticks out. So we're thinking about maritime connections. That's a film that they did for the Sharjah Biennale here. And it was a film about people going from the Gulf of Kutch to the Persian Gulf down to the Gulf of Aden and all these connections between these different lands. So this was our kind of thinking about this. And one other thing that we noticed was that in film festivals, particularly the the European ones, they tended to always want to slot cultures in according to these very kind of essentializing modes of what they thought belonged in that country. And as a result, a lot of the films that we found really interesting, here on the peninsula, wouldn't make it in because they weren't focusing on the particular issues and the particular groups of people. If we could forward to the next slide. So what we did in the book is we tried to look at all these different ways that people had theorized these intercultural connections. So Niall Green, who's a historian, has written a lot about what he calls arenas. And he uses this rather than areas, as in area studies, or worlds, as in the Indian Ocean world. He doesn't use the areas for the obvious reason, and the worlds he doesn't use because it makes it seem as if it's self-contained. And what he wanted to describe is that all these different arenas are somewhat overconnecting and interlapping. So he focuses on the Mediterranean, the Inter-Asia, and the Indian Ocean for this part of the world. Another one was Mary Louise Pratt from her contact zones. And she was looking at Latin America, and she was looking at the contact of Spanish colonizers in particular with indigenous cultures and obviously slaves being brought over as well. And she describes contact zones as these social spaces where disparate cultures meet, clash, and grapple. Okay, so these contexts are all different ways. They have all different sorts of, they can be peaceful and they can be very violent. Another was Tariq Sabri's, his book on Arab culture, and he describes, again, encounters. And one of the things that he does, which is really important for us, is that, particularly for Arab culture, is describing that there's no such thing as a pure culture. Everything is defined by its encounters with other ones. And that's really important because you get all the so-called fundamentalist groups that describe there being, it's a pure Arab culture, pure Muslim culture since forever. And he's really careful to say that, no, that's a very modern construct. And that tradition, so-called tradition, is very much part of modernity. And we also have this in Iran as well. And India has its own version of it under the current regime, with anti-colonial being used in a way that kind of changes its meaning by the BJP. The next is presences, and this is a term that Stuart Hall uses, and he describes it in the Caribbean. And he says that within the Caribbean, there's these different presences, which are kind of like layers. So you've got an African presence, you've got an American presence, you've got a European. There's also obviously a Chinese and a South Asian as well. And we thought that was an interesting way to think about the Gulf, because you've got all these different groups of people coming here at different times. So there's different generations of migration that are also here and constantly shaping and reshaping the place. The next one is Edouard Glissant, another Caribbean philosopher, and he describes the poetics of relation. And this is something that is somewhat like Stuart Hall's, but it allows for ingenuity. Okay, so you can have groups that have kind of lived there and have a rootedness which is slightly different. It also brings in forced migration and errancy is kind of this working away from the dominant structures. And then finally, another one we used is Arjuna Padarai, the anthropologist, his scapes, which was from his book Modernity at Large at the very beginning of kind of the globalization, where he described ethnoscapes, metascapes, technoscapes, financialscapes, and idioscapes, and lots of people have added loads of other ones as well. And these were a different way. All of these are not looking at regions. All of them are not looking at states, and they're certainly not looking at states that call themselves nations. So we thought these would be really interesting concepts to play with and to see how far they would work. And then on the next slide. Thank you for doing our slides for us. So this gets into the unpartitioning film studies. So there's the colonial stereotypes, and these are the ones that we're always familiar with. And in our intro, we trace into these. So Jack Shaheen looks at the ones for Arabs, Dokutom looks at the ones for Africans, and Ramchandra Guha looks at the ones for Indians. And it's the things that we'd expect. But the thing that is surprising is that we still see the same things in film festivals, contemporary competitive film festivals, so-called international ones, although not quite as egregious. So that's the impetus of the film. And if you look, you might recognize on the lower left is Amitabh Bachchan singing I think it's in Dawn, and he's singing in this cabaret scene, which has Gulf Arabs and then also Christians. So it's this illicit space that's not Indian. The center one we'll talk about in a little bit more, but the other one on the far left is a film by Youssef Chahine. And it's kind of making a joke about when Egyptian films started being distributed through Kuwait rather than through Lebanon and having to be cut. So this guy dressed up, an Egyptian guy dressed up as a Gulf Arab says, cut out the scenes with the alcohol, cut out the scenes with whatever. And that gets into some larger things that are happening in Egypt. And we can go to the next slide. So with these new insights that we are hoping to bring by thinking about these fluid spaces, we can go back and look at these other films that are well known from the Gulf and the Peninsula and have different readings. So Alia had talked a little bit about Bestia Bahar, which focuses on the Gulf Arabs, and it kind of erases the Indian component with the Kuwait Bombay Wallahs, the Arab men who had married Indian women, have children, as well as all the indentured servants or slaves that come from Africa. That's the black and white image. In the center is an image of a film called The Day I Became a Woman. And the very last, that film did really well on the International Film Festival market. And people tended to always with Iran, they have that single focus that it's only women. Women is the only issue. And they don't realize that within Iranian politics, there's lots of ethnic minorities, as well as different, what we might call races. So this is down in the island of Kish, which is a free trade island, the third story that's told in it, where this woman presumably from Tehran, with this little boy, and all these little boys are obviously Afro-Iranian. And this is another thing that's kind of erased. And blackness is another thing that's discussed by one of our contributors in Iran, which takes on completely different things with the Iran-Iraq war, and Arabs and black kind of become one. But anyway, this kind of gets erased. The film on the top with the young woman in hijab is Wajda, which is a famous, very well-known Saudi film by Haifal Mansour. And that film, again, it's the single issue, the way that it was reviewed, everybody only looked at women wanting, the little girl wanting to have a bicycle as a metaphor for women wanting to be able to drive. This is pre-driving, but it completely erased all the other kind of economic class-based issues that come up in the film, as well as the ethno-racial one. So this is when Wajda and her boyfriend go to torment Iqbal, her mother's Indian driver, a Pakistani driver, I can't remember which, and kind of play with his vulnerability as a migrant worker to do what they want to do. So that gets left out, and that's a very important part of what that film is about. And Haifal Mansour, I think, kind of thinks about how Saudi women have certain privileges, yet don't have other privileges, and kind of plays the film, but it certainly wasn't reviewed that way. And the last film is Bassem Al-Tawadi, who's a Bahraini filmmaker, and made this film called A Bahraini Tale from 2006. And it actually looks at pre-1967 or pre-1970, I'm not sure which, pre-Naqsa or pre-Nasser stepping down. And when you look at this, you get a real sense of what the Gulf was like. You have Shia, you have Muslims, you also have Jewish people. You have lots of people from India as well. These are young boys trying to sneak in to see a Bollywood film, or a Bombay film, really. So it brings in the whole culture. And lots of people in Bahrain, lots of people in the Gulf understood Hindi and Urdu, even without studying it formally, because it was so much part of the culture. The song Ye Dosti from Sholay, you see it constantly in films that are produced here, student films as well as other films from Kuwait all the way down to UAE. So these are the sort of things we wanted to pull out, and we thought they might be productive for thinking about what's unique here and why it's left out by other places. And I think the next slide gets into, I'm now transitioning into, in addition to inviting Khaled Al-Sadiq to screen Bastia Bahar, we also invited Amar Al-Attar, who's a Emirati photographer and artist, to curate, to actually exhibit his work, Cinemas in the UAE. And this was a really interesting project that he did. He had done an earlier project, the name of which is, I'm forgetting at the moment, but he had gone to small photography shops throughout the Northern Emirates. So this is Ras Al Khaimah, Al Quwain, Ajman, so above Dubai. And he went to the little photographers that people would go in with their families or to get their passport photos, whatever. And he started developing a relationship with these people. A lot of them were Iranian, a lot of them were South Asian. And eventually they often gave him their archival collection. So he did an exhibit reproducing some of those photographs, with permissions from the families, etc. This was another one he did. And he remembered always going with his family to see whatever film was playing. They would go on Friday when it was still the weekend. People would go on Fridays to go see the film. And what he noticed was that the cinemas that not the ones that he went to as a young child, but the older ones that existed when he was a child, were starting to disappear. So these are these cinemas that you see here in these photographs. And these are some of the first freestanding ones from the 1980s, maybe some of them from the 1970s, but mostly 1980s. There had been earlier ones with the British and the US in the 1940s, 1930s. And he started taking portraits of these spaces, both the exterior and the interior. And you can go down to the next slide, before they were destroyed. And with this one, he was actually there when it was destroyed. So he actually took photos of it being demolished. He also at the same time spoke to the managers of these places and asked, like, could he have any artifacts that they had? And they were very happy to give him everything that, anything that he wanted. So if you pull down, keep going down in the slides. So I went and did a studio visit with him in 2016 before he had exhibited this stuff. And he had like a huge reel, and I think it's a 35 millimeter reel of a Hindi film, posters from different films. He was thinking about reproducing them different ways. But what he ended up doing, and if you go to the next slide, is he exhibited it more as like a research-based art project. So he had all these different kind of ephemera. These were the things that would have been just tossed away. Nobody would have preserved them. So you've got tickets to the Plaza Cinema, one that's gone. He also, by speaking to people, learned all these stories that for the business history of the Gulf. So one cinema on one side of the Dubai Creek, Port Dubai, would rent a film, and then it would sub-rent it to another cinema on the other side. And at that point, they were just rowed abra, these boats that go by rowing that would go back and forth. So they'd stagger the time. So say the film would start at 8 p.m. on one side, it would start at 9 p.m. on the other. And people would be going back and forth with the reels the whole time. So they were able to, both cinemas could split the price and both, show the film to their audiences. He also found loads of letters, and these were letters that were before there was official kind of censorship organization in the UAE. And it's a GCC one. And I know that from a PhD student whose thesis I was a reader of, that kind of didn't happen until a little bit later. So you have all these kind of like one-on-one correspondences to get films in, to get films shown. Films were not censored in the same way that they kind of are today, in the sense that I think there are different films that were kind of promoted as kind of like what they were called sexual content or something like that, like Kama Sutra type films. And I don't know, I hadn't seen the actual films. I don't think they were pornography, but they certainly were organized that way. He was also interested in the way that the films are, film posters were displayed. And the bottom photo on the bottom left is a photo of some posters that he's reprinted. So the photo, the poster rather from Sangram, he's reprinted that on a yellow piece of paper. And he put them inside these wooden frames that have chicken wire in front of them. And they would put them in chicken wire because people would steal them, because they would collect them. They're kind of souvenirs and people, wanted them. So anyway, he was really fascinated with all these stories that emerged. And if you go down to the next slide, we can look at how it was installed here at NYU Abu Dhabi in 2018. So we actually put the posters out in a public space so people would see them. And you can keep scrolling down. And then inside, the backs of the chairs from one of the cinemas that was torn apart. And some of the chairs are actually put into the only kind of art house cinema in Dubai called Simakil. But these are just the backs and then the posters that he's reproduced. And you get to see the variety of films. There were PLO films, there were Indian films, Pakistani films, of course, Egyptian films, British films, Hollywood films. It was extremely eclectic. And it kind of reveals who's going to see these films and also what people were choosing. The colonial film cinemas tended to show Hollywood films because it was still part of that kind of civilizing mission. So there's lots of articles, and Farah Arak, who has a Japanese book, goes a lot into that about the Bombay office navigating between the British desire for particular types of films to be shown in the Gulf and Bahrain. And there are always films that emphasize British culture as being perfect and good and a model, whereas audiences actually would much rather watch Indian films or Egyptian films. And I think there might be one or two more slides that are just, yeah, these are just more images of the objects that he cites. So we've also got the glass slides that they used to put before the films would start that would say, like, you know, Eid Mubarak, Happy New Year, no smoking. I think there's one that says don't film. And then you've got the list. This is from Itani Cinema. So anyway, he collected all these things. And the thing that fascinated him is that it's all these informal business stories, you know, because things were not completely organized as they are now. So you get to see all these like idiosyncrasies, contradictions of what one would expect. And he did this in this exhibit. And I think, are there any more slides? That might be the last. These are just slides of the exhibit here on our campus.
This was the last one.
Okay, and that's lots of. So anyway, so this was fascinating, and we invited a whole bunch of scholars to the conference as well. And I think, you know, that the Basya Bahar being able to see that film with Halal al-Siddiq, who passed away a couple years later, and then also getting to see this exhibit really changed their mind. And a lot of the people we invited either worked on South Asian cinema or Arab cinema, and they were beginning to make these connections. And this is a good transition because some of the people were working exactly in this in-between area, and one of whom is Bintu Menon. So I'll turn it over to Bintu.
Bindu ma'am, just let me know if you can share your PPT. If you can't, I will share.
I'll just try. Yeah. I think I can. Right. Is it visible?
It is visible. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, and thanks, Dale, for that very, very nice transition, which also reminds me of the 2018 NYU Abu Dhabi conference, which was very important for a half a dozen of us who were working on the India Gulf connections in media, but did not have a very consolidated space for conversations. I also remember the fabulous photo exhibition, watching the first Gulf film, Alia's interaction with the filmmaker, and so on. So this is my second, and all of us who had been at that conference has published with Dale and Alia, either in the journal volume that they edited, special issue that they edited, or in this volume. And luckily for me, I've been part of both. So both Alia and Dale had very elaborately kind of laid out both theoretically and historically the frameworks through which Gulf needs to be repositioned in film and media studies, but also for other disciplines. So I wouldn't spend much time on that. I thought that it's probably most useful for to make use of this space to talk about many of the methodological and other kinds of questions that come up when one attempts a different kind of media modernity and transnational relations, which are not often seen as important to the formation of the discipline or ongoing conversations in the discipline. So of primarily film and media studies. So I just want to, I wanted to for those who haven't read the book, haven't seen the table of contents, etc., my essay is on the movement of audio cassettes, but also the ludic ways in which migrants worked with, particularly sound technologies. So I do this by paying attention to or doing a very close reading of a particular genre, which is a very migrant genre in the language of Malayalam. And as many of you who are very much engaged in West Asian studies scholarship would already recognize that Kerala is one of the most important outlier centers of migration to the Persian Gulf cities. So in the essay, what I try to do is to do a very close reading of the genre of Dubai Khatta or Dubai letter, and what it and the affective world and the registers around which that genre was created, and also the genre circulated. The second is to look at practices around the audio cassette itself, practices like recording letters and on audio cassettes. And those cassettes were circulated between the migrants and their family, their friends and others living back home in Kerala. So I look at both these practices and the genre itself to understand a certain sonic world of migration, understand the voice which is distinctly shaped through processes of migration, etc. But very quickly, also there are questions which are really important which are of political economic significance, which frames this whole conversation that I tried to generate in my paper. So even though in the beginnings of audio cassettes and stereophony, etc., in the Indian subcontinent were uneven upon its production in the decade of the 1970s, its popularity and use grew rapidly in the Indian vernaculars in the early years of 1980s. Now, very heterogeneous in its genre component, the audio cassettes also presented a very rich and variegated kind of soundscape of devotional music, lyrical songs, classical music, folk music, religious sermons, jazz, film music, and even vococentric mimicry in many of the vernacular contexts. So part of the reason for this growth in the market for audio cassettes owes to the opening up of the Indian market for consumer goods and a very attendant culture of consumption of media products in the economic measures that were implemented after the end of the internal emergency in 1975. This also, has to be co-located with the easing up of market regulations that allowed a greater inflow of media goods into the Indian market. The open Gulf markets and the East Asian markets and the movement of goods made the circulation of this kind of medial objects very, in very rapid ways across the Indian Ocean, particularly between the Persian Gulf cities and the western ports of India. And this, I think, is very important and this is something which I've been working on for some time now, to think about to the emergence of a media modernity, particularly in the southwestern coast of India, through this kind of relations that bind both the coasts. So this in all of this, one can also see that if one looks at what has happened in the context of film and media technologies, that it's both surprising and not so surprising that the widespread aesthetic and social implications have been largely ignored of this particular relation is largely ignored in music, sound, and media studies, it's somewhere it looks like what sociologist Bruno Latour would say about pervasive technologies, that many of them are made invisible by their own success and kind of masked by their own second nature. So they were all around. People used it in everyday, through everyday registers, played with it, made media, made connections, etc., but they were not very well, studied or not part of our knowledge production. So, and there are exceptions like Tejaswi Niranjan's work on endangered labor migration, Indian nationalism, and music imaginaries between the Trinidad and the Western and Indian coast, but not necessarily between the Gulf and Kerala. There are interesting cultural histories of the audio cassette in this particular genre that I'm talking about, but not necessarily media work on this. But the recent turn towards the connectivity across the Indian Ocean, space, and migration studies have converged in the discipline of film and media studies in interesting ways in the recent past. So I kind of used methods which are used within media studies and sound studies, etc., to understand the creation of a voice in them, but also moved on to other sets of relations like audio technologies, acoustic spaces, listening techniques, etc., which are excavated through ethnographic and participatory observation, and centered my conversation around audio cassette practices that include speech and music exchanges between Malayali migrants in the GCC and their homes in the Kerala coast. So through all of this, what I also realized very importantly is that as a concept, the Middle East strikes to me as more remarkable for its persistence across the different registers of everyday life than its geographic, political, or cultural coherence. And as a scholar who works on the history of media modernity, as I said, the hermetically sealed nature of such conversations started emerging in very stark colors for me when I started looking at not just the audio cassettes, but many other, kind of media that I worked on. Alongside the scholarly work that reimagines the Middle East as a contact zone, for example, Dale's own work, we need to think very seriously across the geographically bound space of both the Middle East and the western coast of India. Thinking through the Middle East through the histories of movement then begins to reckon with contiguous as much as continuous spaces rather than divided continents, as it is more and more evident as we pay attention to many of the themes that emerge in the book. Particularly in film and media studies, where the traces and excesses of the media object is what leads the conversation, the Middle East, I would say, is a global entity within which multiple connections happen as opposed to the continents truncated and divided by the idea of nations and borders. How are we to think about the spatial imaginary of the Middle East away from the paradigm of either area studies or distinct maritime spaces, or even a certain sealed nature of media studies? Our present imaginations, I would say, are equally the residue of colonialism and nationalism and the partition of the world during the Cold War and the pedagogical structures at universities and academic production that has largely worked within this curtailment of the conceptualizations of space. Moving out of these methodological limitations of hermeneutically sealed film and media, as many of the works have recently shown, might thus open up opportunities to integrate and advance in newer ways, not just the space of the Middle East, but even the space where I am located in, particularly the coastal spaces. So I'll end by saying that this seems to be a good and very productive template that and a very deep and complex conversation that Dale and Alia has generated in the book, not just in curating and selecting the kind of essays which problematize the space of Middle East, but also in their own extremely well-written, well-argued, remarkable sort of introduction, which again is something which is, we need to co-locate with certain efforts which are happening in other spaces as well, to excavate media histories that are deeply entangled, not only in this defined spaces like the nation and the or the region, etc., but that are deeply entangled with other geographies, languages, and industries. I'll conclude by saying that thank you for this opportunity.